Okpolo avoided Isoken as much as possible. She spent most of her time wandering aimlessly around the house, humming the same haunting tune that she always had. Her vacant eyes never seemed to focus on anything, and her once ragged appearance, though now clothed in fine fabrics, still carried the air of madness that had plagued her from the beginning. She was a living ghost in his home, and her presence suffocated Okpolo's every waking moment. At night, when the mansion was quiet and dark, Okpolo would lie awake, staring at the ceiling. He had money, but he had no peace. The wealth he had dreamed of all his life now felt like a curse, binding him to a woman he couldn't stand to be around. He longed for companionship, for someone to share his success with. But how could he ever bring another woman into his life when he was tied to Isoken? No one would ever understand why he had married her, and the shame of his secret weighed him down like a heavy stone. As the days turned into weeks, Okpolo became increasingly isolated. He stopped inviting people to his mansion, afraid that they would see Isoken and start asking questions. He cut himself off from his friends, even Jude, who had once been the one to guide him down this path. Despite all the wealth he now possessed, Okpolo was lonelier than he had ever been before. One evening, Okpolo sat alone in the grand living room of his mansion, sipping from a glass of expensive wine. The house was eerily silent except for the faint sound of Isoken humming in the distance. The hum, once a quiet background noise, now seemed louder and more intrusive, making it impossible for him to relax. Frustrated, Okpolo slammed his glass down on the table and stood up. He couldn't take it anymore. The weight of his decision, the endless presence of Isoken, and the constant hum, it was all too much. He needed to talk to someone, anyone. He decided to call Jude. Jude, Okpolo said when his friend picked up the phone. His voice was tense. I need to see you. I can't take this anymore. There was a pause on the other end of the line before Jude responded. What's going on, Okpolo? You are rich now, man. What could be bothering you? It's not the money, Okpolo replied. His voice was trembling. It's her, the mad woman. I can't stand living with her anymore. She's always there, always humming, always pregnant. I thought I could handle it, but I can't. I need a way out. Jude sighed heavily. I warned you, Okpolo. This is the price of the wealth you wanted. There is no easy way out of this. I don't care, Okpolo shouted, his frustration boiling over. I'll do anything to be free from her. I don't care about the money anymore. I just want my life back. There was silence on the other end of the line, and for a moment, Okpolo wondered if Jude had hung up. But then Jude spoke. His voice was low and serious. Listen to me, Okpolo, Jude said. You can't just walk away from this. The herbalist warned you. If you leave the mad woman, if you try to throw her out, everything will fall apart. You will lose everything. Your money, your house, your cars. You will go back to being poorer than you were before. Do you really want that? Okpolo's heart sank. The thought of losing all the wealth he had gained terrified him. He had spent his whole life dreaming of being rich, and now that he had it, the idea of giving it up felt impossible. But at the same time, he couldn't bear the thought of living with Isoken for the rest of his life. The constant presence of the mad woman was driving him to the brink of insanity. I don't know what to do, Jude, Okpolo whispered, his voice breaking. I can't keep living like this. Then you need to make a choice, Jude replied. You either accept the life you've chosen, with all its consequences, or you give it all up and walk away. But remember, once you walk away, there's no going back. You will lose everything. Okpolo ended the call without responding. For everyone who is asking about how to create folktale stories like this and get their channels monetized in 30 days, like I got this channel monetized in exactly 24 days from scratch without ads or any paid collaboration, click the link in the description of this video or in the pinned comment to learn how to do same. Let's continue our story. He sat in silence, staring at the phone in his hands, his mind racing. Could he really give up everything he had worked so hard to gain? Could he really walk away from the wealth, knowing that he would return to a life of poverty and struggle he had fought so hard to escape? As he sat there, lost in thought, Isoken's hum grew louder. It echoed through the halls of the mansion, filling the empty space with its haunting melody. Opolo pressed his hands to his ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was of no use. The hum was inescapable, a constant reminder of the sacrifice he had made and the price he now had to pay. As the days passed, Obolo's frustration only grew. No matter where he went, he could always hear Isoken's haunting hum. He tried to distract himself with luxuries, buying more cars, more clothes, and throwing lavish parties in an attempt to drown out the reality of his situation. But none of these brought him peace. The worst part was the isolation. Ogbolo avoided inviting friends over, afraid they would see Isoken and begin asking questions he couldn't answer. He avoided going out in public with her, fearing the judgmental looks from strangers and the whispers that followed. Everyone knew that a mad woman was living with him, and even though Okpolo claimed it was out of love, no one truly believed him. He had become a subject of gossip, and no amount of wealth could shield him from the shame. One evening, Okpolo sat alone in his bedroom, staring at himself in the mirror. His reflection was unrecognizable. He had aged beyond his years, and his eyes were dull from lack of sleep. The bags under his eyes told the story of sleepless nights spent worrying about the life he had trapped himself in. He was wealthy, yes, but he was also miserable. The joy he had once imagined wealth would bring was nowhere to be found. Ogbolo's thoughts turned once again to the herbalist's warning. The old man had been clear. If Ogbolo tried to abandon Isoken, all the wealth he had gained would disappear. He would lose everything and return to a life of poverty. But was wealth worth the price of his sanity? Could he continue living like this, forever tied to a woman who would never give birth, never change, and never bring him happiness? The thought of walking away terrified him, but so did the thought of living the rest of his life in this miserable state. Obolo felt as if he were being pulled in two different directions, each path leading to a kind of suffering he couldn't bear to face. That night, as Opolo lay in bed, he made a decision. He couldn't live like this any longer. He didn't care about the wealth anymore. What good was all the money in the world if he couldn't find peace, if he couldn't sleep, if he couldn't be free? He would rather be poor and happy than rich and be trapped in this nightmare. With his decision made, Opolo rose early the next morning, determined to put his plan into action. He knew that leaving Isoken would mean losing everything, but he had convinced himself that it was worth it. He would find a way to live a simpler life, far from the madness that now consumed him. He packed a small bag, filled with only the essentials. As he walked through the vast empty halls of his mansion, he felt a strange sense of relief. It was as though a weight was slowly being lifted from his shoulders. He would finally be free, or so he thought. But just as Opolo was about to leave, he heard a knock at the door. His heart raced, and he froze in place, wondering who could possibly be visiting him this early. When he opened the door, there stood Jude, his old friend, with a grave look on his face. Opolo, Jude said with a low voice, "We need to talk." Opolo stepped aside, letting Jude into the house. The tension in the air was palpable, and Opolo felt a knot form in his stomach. He knew Jude was here to talk about Isoken, about the life Opolo had tried to escape from. "I know what you are planning," Jude said as he sat down on one of the plush chairs in the living room. "You can't do it." "Do what?" Opolo asked, feigning ignorance. "Leave her. I know you are planning to walk away. You are planning to abandon the mad woman, but you can't." The herbalist was clear. You walk away, you lose everything. You'll be poorer than you ever were before. "I don't care anymore, Jude," Opolo replied. His voice was trembling. "I can't live like this. I can't keep pretending everything is fine while I'm trapped with a mad woman who will never give me peace. I'd rather be poor again than live like this." Jude sighed and shook his head. "You don't know what you are saying. The life of poverty is not one that you can just walk back into and think you'll be fine. You've had a taste of wealth now, and I'm telling you, once it's gone, you'll regret it. You'll wish you never gave it up." "I'll take that chance," Opolo replied. His determination was growing. "I'd rather be free and poor than rich and miserable." Jude stood up. "You think you are making a noble choice, but you are just running away from your problems. You wanted wealth. and now you have it. You can't just walk away from the consequences because it's hard. That's not how it works. I don't know what I was getting into, Okpolo snapped. I don't know I'd be tied to a mad woman for the rest of my life. None of us ever know what sacrifices we'll have to make for success, Jude said coldly. But you made your choice. Now you have to live with it. Jude left without another word, leaving Okpolo standing alone in the grand living room. The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, doubt crept into his mind. Was he really making the right decision? Could he truly walk away from everything he had worked for? But then he heard it again, that maddening hum, echoing through the house, haunting him as it always did. No, he couldn't. He had to leave. Opolo turned his back on the mansion and stepped out the door, leaving behind the life of wealth and misery that had trapped him for so long. Before we continue our story, hit the subscribe button right now, please, and turn on post notifications so that whenever we make a post, you'll be the first to get notified. Please subscribe before we continue our story. Have you subscribed? Let's continue. So he walked away from the life he had built and left everything behind. And for the first time in months, he felt a strange sense of freedom. Yet deep inside, there was a pit of uncertainty. He had made his decision, but the reality of what was to come began to settle in. Opolo walked through the city, his mind racing with thoughts of what life would be like without his wealth. He hadn't yet become poor, but he knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. The herbalist's warning echoed in his mind. Once he left the mad woman, the wealth would vanish. But for now, he still had money in his pocket, and that was enough to get by. He wandered aimlessly, not sure where he was going or what he was looking for. For so long, he had dreamed of being rich, of living a life of luxury. But now that he had it, he had found that the wealth came with chains. No amount of money could bring him happiness as long as he was tied to his soken. The thought of returning to a life of poverty scared him, but he tried to push that fear aside. As the days went on, Ogbolo found himself in a small diggy bar in the outskirts of the town. He sat at the corner table, nursing a bottle of beer, staring blankly at the television screen that flickered with images of news reports and commercials. The noise around him was muffled, as if he were in a bubble, completely disconnected from the world. His thoughts were interrupted when an old man sitting nearby leaned over and spoke. "You look troubled, young man," the old man said. "What is troubling you?" Opolo glanced at the man, not in the mood to talk, but something about the stranger's calm demeanor made him open up. "I gave up my wealth," Opolo muttered. "I couldn't live in the sacrifice I made to get it." The old man raised an eyebrow, intrigued. That's not something you hear every day. Most people would hold on to their wealth no matter the cost. Not when the cost is your sanity, Okbolo replied, taking a swig from his bottle. I had to marry a mad woman. She's pregnant, but she'll never give birth. I couldn't take it anymore, so I left. The old man nodded slowly, as if he understood. Sacrifices are a part of life, but it's rare to hear someone walk away from such a deal. You must have been so desperate. I was, Okpolo admitted. I wanted to be rich. I wanted to have everything. But now I had it. I realized I wasn't happy. I couldn't stand living with her. It was just like living in a nightmare. The old man leaned back in his chair. Wealth can be a prison if you are not careful. The things we sacrifice to get it often come back to haunt us. But are you ready for what is to come now that you've walked away? Okpolo's stomach churned at the thought. He knew what was coming. The wealth he had built, the mansions, the cars, it would all disappear. He would be back to square one, poorer than he had been before. I don't know if I'm ready, Okpolo said quietly, but I couldn't live like that anymore. I'd rather be poor and have my peace than be rich and miserable. The old man smiled faintly. There's wisdom in that, but poverty isn't easy either. You'll have to face challenges you thought you had left behind. Are you sure you can handle that? Okpolo didn't have an answer. The thought terrified him, but he had already made his choice. There was no turning back now. Just as the old man was about to speak again, Okpolo's phone burst in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw that it was a message from Jude. Hesitating for a moment, he opened the message, already expecting what he would say. Okpolo, it's happening. The money's gone. Your accounts are empty. The banks are already asking questions about the mansion and the cars. You need to come back and face this. Man, everything is falling apart. Opolo's heart sank. It had begun. The collapse of his riches was happening faster than he had expected. He stared at the message. The old man beside him watched quietly, sensing the shift in Opolo's mood. It's happening, isn't it? The old man asked him. Opolo nodded. His throat was tight. It's all gone. Just like that. He finished his beer and stood up, tossing some crumpled bills on the table. Opolo walked out of the bar, stepping into the cool night air. He was heading back to the very poverty he had once tried to desperately escape. But this time, he hoped he would find something different, a sense of peace, perhaps, or at least the freedom he had been denied in his gilded prison of wealth. The city felt colder than it had ever been. It was as though the universe was mocking him, reminding him of his decision to abandon the riches that had come at such a high cost. His footsteps echoed in the stillness of the night, and he realized that he had nowhere to go. The mansion wasn't there anymore. His bank accounts were drained. The respect and admiration he had briefly enjoyed from his neighbors and friends would soon turn into pity, or worse, ridicule. He stopped by a roadside stall where a woman was packing up her goods for the night. The smell of roasted plantains filled the air, making his stomach growl. Obolo realized he had not eaten all day. The thought of food seemed foreign to him. Luxuries like dining in fine restaurants had been his reality for so long. Now, he barely had a few naira in his pocket. How much for one plantain? He asked the woman. The woman glanced at him and sized him up. His designer clothes still looked somewhat presentable, but she could sense that something was off about him. 50 naira, she replied. Her tone was indifferent. Obolo fumbled in his pocket and pulled out a crumpled bill. It was the last of the money he had taken with him when he left the mansion. He handed it over to the woman and took the plantain. Just days ago, he could have bought an entire store without blinking. Now, he was reduced to counting coins for a meal. He sat on the roadside, eating the plantain slowly, savoring every bite. The harsh reality of his new life was sinking deeper with each bite. There would be no more fancy dinners, no more luxury. He was back to being the same Opolo who had once struggled to make ends meet. Only that now, the fall felt harder. As he ate, Opolo's mind wandered back to his friend Jude. He hadn't responded to Jude's message, but he knew he needed to face the consequences sooner or later. Jude had warned him about the collapse of his wealth, and now Opolo was experiencing it in real time. When he finished the plantain, Opolo stood up and wiped his hands on his trousers. He looked around, trying to decide where to go. He couldn't return to the mansion, and his pride wouldn't allow him to seek help from Jude, so he began walking again, his feet carrying him aimlessly through the city streets. The night was long, and Opolo had found himself in a part of the city he hadn't visited in years. It was where he had lived before his brief stints with wealth. The houses were small and cramped. He stopped in front of a small, dilapidated building that looked even worse than he remembered. His old house, the place he had once called home. Opolo stood there for so long, staring at the building, memories flooding his mind. He had fought so hard to escape this life, to rise above poverty that had been denied him for so long. But now, it seemed he had come full circle. He had been to the top and was now crashing back to the bottom. A sudden movement caught his attention, and he turned to see an old woman stepping out of the house next door. It was Mrs. Idaro, his former neighbor. She squinted at him in the dim light, her wrinkled face twisting in confusion, before she recognized him. Opolo, is that you? She asked, surprised. Opolo hesitated, unsure how to respond. Yes, it's me, he replied. The old woman moved closer. Curious, she asked, I heard you became rich, eh? They said you built a mansion and drove big cars. Is that true? Opolo felt a lump in his throat. How could he explain to her what had happened? It was true, he muttered, avoiding her gaze, but things changed. Without another word, he turned away and walked deeper into the streets of his old neighborhood, leaving Mrs. Idaro standing there, still puzzled. By the next morning, it was time to confront the reality of his situation. Everything was gone. As he wandered the street, The familiar sight began to stir something within him. He remembered the joy of simple pleasures, the warmth of friendship, the laughter shared over humble meals, and the satisfaction of honest work. These were the things that had once brought him joy, before greed and ambition clouded his judgment. For the first time in a long while, Opolo felt truly alone. The wealth was gone, the mad woman was behind him, and all that he had left were memories from that life that would never return. All right. So, what did you learn from this story? Share it in the comment section. And please subscribe to this channel right now and turn on post notification so that whenever a story is posted, you'll be the first to get notified and you'll be the first to watch. Like and share this. Don't forget to drop your lessons in the comment section. Subscribe and see you in our next story. Bye bye.